almost 40 years on from the Chernobyl disaster, there are still many mysteries, conspiracy theories, and unanswered questions surrounding the event of April 26, 1986. The event is the most famous nuclear disaster in history, but much remains hidden from the public eye. Number 10. In the decades since the Chernobyl disaster, the town of Pripyat has become infamous as a dark tourist location. Up until recently, tourists could go on official guides through the abandoned city, left almost untouched for decades. There are also many people who snuck into the city to go on less official tours of the creepy and dilapidated buildings. Taking anything from the exclusion zone into the outside is extremely prohibited. Some items that have been left behind are so irradiated that they can still cause health problems if held onto for an extended period of time. But those risks haven't stopped some from removing items, even from the most dangerous parts of Pripyat. When disaster struck at the power plant, firefighters and first responders from the surrounding area rushed to the scene. Those who arrived earliest were completely unprepared for what they were facing. Their rubber boots and helmets offered little protection against the irradiated dust and gases they would be breathing in while trying to battle the flames. It wasn't long before many started to show signs of radiation sickness. If proper procedure was followed, the contaminated clothing they were wearing would be left at the power plant before they were taken to the hospital. That would contain the worst of the contamination in one location. But in the rush to get the people the help they needed, many firefighters were transported to the hospital in Pripyat, still wearing the suits that they'd gotten sick while wearing. Once they arrived at the hospital, the dirty suits, boots, and helmets were removed and sent to the hospital basement. It quickly became one of the most dangerous places in the entire city. Even decades later, the contamination level here was worse than almost anywhere else. For years, the hospital was featured on tours, although it's likely that many of these didn't get official permission to venture into this infamous location. Tourists could even go down into the basement, though they were recommended to wear specialist clothing to keep themselves safe. At some point, all the entrances to this basement, except one, were sealed off, restricting access even further. Any detection equipment would pick up the large amounts of radiation being emitted by the clothing kept in the basement, and anyone who knew anything about the hospital would likely know just how dangerous everything stored there was. But that didn't stop one person from removing a helmet from the basement and placing it near the entrance to the hospital. It sat on the floor and would be easy to overlook among all the other eerie and disturbing sights at the hospital. The location was abandoned just days after the disaster, with cots, equipment, and medicines left behind. One lone helmet wouldn't draw much attention if it wasn't for the radiation detectors that would go off if they passed close by. It allegedly emitted 168 microsieverts per hour, much more than the typical background radiation in the exclusion zone. This alone would be disturbing enough, but at some point, that helmet vanished. Only the highly irradiated straps were left behind. Who did this and why is a mystery. Perhaps the most important question is where the helmet is today, and that remains unknown. Number 9. In the exclusion zones that surround Chernobyl, wildlife has flourished. Plants, animals, fungi, and even bacteria have adapted to this new environment where humans can no longer live. In the 30 years since the disaster, the abandoned areas of Ukraine and Belarus have become some of the best places for scientists to study the effects of radiation on animals and what happens when humans disappear. In 2024, research into the wolf populations around Chernobyl made a startling discovery. The wolves seem to have evolved a resistance to cancer. Wolf numbers within the Chernobyl exclusion zone and certain areas in Belarus are much bigger than the surrounding areas. At first, this might not seem too surprising. Many animals have been able to thrive in these irradiated environments, with even endangered species like Eurasian bison and Przewalski's horses finding a comfortable home here. There's obviously a danger from the radiation that still lingers around Chernobyl, but scientists have found the dangers of radiation are less of a limiting factor for these wild animals than humans are. This is one of few places in the world without any humans, and animals have been able to take advantage of that. so it shouldn't be surprising that wolves are among those that are thriving there. Wild wolf populations still exist in the border regions of Ukraine, as well as in Belarus, just to the north of Chernobyl. There were likely populations already living in the region when the Chernobyl disaster occurred, and they only grew in number when the pressures from humans disappeared. But wolves are at the top of the food chain, which makes them more at risk of health effects from radiation. They take on all the radiation within the prey animals they eat, which in turn take on all the radiation from the plants they've consumed. It should lead to a buildup of radiation within the population. Even without pressures like hunting from humans, it should stunt a population's growth, but scientists have found that this isn't the case. In 2014, scientists ventured into the exclusion zone to study the wolves. The animals were fitted with GPS collars that had dosimeters attached. This meant that scientists could record the radioactivity levels the wolves were experiencing in real time. They also took samples from the animals so their DNA could be analyzed. What they found was shocking. The DNA from the Chernobyl wolves differed from those outside the exclusion zone. The wolves had an altered immune system, which scientists described as being similar to that of cancer patients undergoing radiation treatment. Analyzing the wolves' genome revealed parts of their DNA that seemed to be responsible for the resistance or resilience against cancer. Scientists didn't think this was some genetic mutation caused directly by the radiation itself. Radiation can cause genetic mutations, but usually these aren't beneficial to the organisms, and many can even cause cancer rather than prevent it. Rather, this seemed to be a case of natural selection that had happened rapidly. Wolves were born with genes that stopped them from getting cancer, or helped them fight the disease if they had it. They lived longer and were able to pass these genes on to their offspring. Number 8. In the days after the disaster, controlling what remained of Reactor 4 became a top priority. Most of this was done from the air, with helicopter crews risking their lives to dump materials into the smoldering reactor in an attempt to smother the burning material inside. But the actions only helped to create a mystery that a special operation was designed to solve. The reactor itself wasn't acting in the way scientists expected. One of the factors that was causing confusion was the heat levels. In order to properly contain the disaster, scientists needed to know what was going on, so they had a better idea of what the materials would do in the future. The problem was that the sand, lead, and other materials that had been dumped on Reactor 4 to try to control the blaze had solidified into a thick shell. If scientists wanted to know what was going on, they would need something to penetrate that shell. To make things worse, this device also would have been deployed from the air. It was an extremely difficult task, as well as dangerous. 2 identical devices were created. One would be used for training, while the other was to be deployed directly into the power plant. They were called the Needle, giving the operation its name in English, Operation Needle. The Needle was an 18-meter-long steel tube, packed with sensors and devices. 200 meters of cables were attached to the Needle, which would then be connected to machines that could record the data. The Needle also featured a camera and lights to help the pilot lower the needle into the reactor. Next, a trial was put on to determine the best pilots for the job. The pilots in question didn't actually know what they were being tested for. They were tasked with lowering a metal cone into a small square from a height of 200 meters. Only one of the pilots, a man named Mikola Melnik, managed to achieve the task. At the time, he thought this might be training for some kind of display. He soon discovered the horrifying truth of the job. On June 19, 1986, Operation Needle took place. Melnik made 3 attempts to lower the needle into the reactor. On the first 2 attempts, the needle didn't penetrate the crust, only bouncing off. This damaged the lights and camera, and the final attempt needed to be made without any assistance. But finally, on that 3rd attempt, the needle pierced the crust, and it was a success. The next step of the mission was to disconnect the cables so scientists on the ground could connect them to equipment in a safe room. But the disconnect didn't go to plan. The cables fell into an unplanned location and ended up hanging near some windows on the outside of the building. Getting to this area from the ground would be extremely dangerous, as the radiation levels were very high here. Luckily, a group of scientists and a camera crew were passing by the area on the other side of the window, documenting the state of the building. One of the scientists smashed open a window and collected the cables, allowing Operation Needle's data to be collected. The needles showed that the temperatures within the shell ranged from 57 to 300 degrees centigrade. This caused some confusion to scientists and wasn't cleared up when more probes were added nearby. The needle's data didn't seem to line up with what other probes were saying. It wasn't until 3 years later, when radiation levels had lowered enough for scientists to visit the area, that they realized the mistake. The needle had missed the reactor and instead hit a nearby pool. Number 7. The exact number of people who lost their lives in the 1986 Chernobyl disaster remains a mystery to this day. Even exact figures of those who passed away in the intermediate aftermath can vary, but it's generally agreed that around 30 people lost their lives in the first few months. Of those, most of the names are not well known, even to those familiar with the Chernobyl meltdown, but each individual had their own experience on that day. Ivan Lukich Orlov was one of the victims of the disaster, and a man whose story has been largely forgotten. Details of Orlov's heroic actions in April of 1986 are hidden away in interviews taken in the brief time he served after the accident. Much of the story has been confused over the years, with his actions attributed to others. Orlov was born in January of 1941. By 1986, he was working at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant as a construction worker. He wasn't a nuclear scientist. His job was helping to construct the new reactor 5, which was scheduled to be operational in November of that year. Orlov and a team of workers were on duty the night of the disaster. While scientists were running experiments on reactor 4, the construction workers were deep underground, working on electrics beneath reactor 5. Ivan was not among them. He was in the construction team's headquarters on the site, hundreds of meters away from the reactor. Just after 1:20 a.m., a blast came from the reactor. Plumes of black clouds were sent away from the core and soon began to fall down on the surrounding area as black rain. Orlov was caught out in the rain and completely soaked in the microscopic remains of the core. Rather than fleeing the scene, Orlov joined the efforts to control the disaster. Orlov is often recorded as having fought fires inside the reactor hull, but this wasn't the case. Balls of fire had fallen into the industrial area, and this is where Orlov's focus was. He wanted to protect the site and make sure that the flames didn't reach anything too dangerous within the grounds. Even though there wasn't any nuclear fuel here, there was still plenty that could add to the devastation if it erupted into flames. He was eventually taken to the hospital after being contaminated with a huge amount of radiation. Orlov had received doses higher than many of the firefighters who'd been working directly at the reactor. At first, his wounds seemed to be confined to his mouth, but doctors watched as burns spread across most of his body. It was a horrifying sight, and Orlov was in a lot of pain in the final days of his life. He passed away on May 13th, just 17 days after the disaster. Orlov was buried in Moscow, along with many of the other victims of the Chernobyl disaster. A plaque at his gravesite bears an etching of his face. He left behind a 16-year-old son, also named Ivan. In the years since the disaster, Orlov's story has been confused with that of a paramedic who was one of the first responders at the site. There were also other Orlovs at work on the power plant, as the name is not uncommon in Ukraine, which has only led to further confusion about Ivan Orlov's actions that fateful day. Number 6. Since humans evacuated from the areas surrounding the Chernobyl power plant, nature has taken over, and many animals have found this a place where they can thrive. There's still extremely high levels of radiation in the environment, but it seems that this is more detrimental to humans than any animal species. One of the strangest animals to have thrived since the nuclear disaster is the catfish that swims in the cooling pond near the plant. The Chernobyl cooling pond is a large artificial reservoir located close to the Pripyat River. When the plant was still in use, it was used to cool down heat exchangers. There are devices that transfer heat from one cooling liquid to another without the two liquids interacting. During the disaster, a huge amount of water was used to try to put out fires within the reactor. That water became contaminated with radioactive material and was soon washed into the cooling pond. Unlike the water washed into the river, there was no escape for the radioactive material, and it still lingers in the water. But so do many fish and other animals that call bodies of water home. A disturbing mutant fish swimming in the waste of a nuclear power plant has become a familiar trope in pop culture. This has led to some misconceptions about the catfish that live in the Chernobyl cooling ponds. The catfish have been called giant mutant monsters. They are extremely large, with some reaching the size of over 2 meters. Even without knowing anything about their disturbing history, the animals do look like some kind of sea monster. But scientists don't think this giant size is down to anything radioactive after all. The type of catfish that swim in the Chernobyl pond are Welsh catfish. In 2015, an Italian fisherman caught a catfish that measured 8 feet and 9 inches. This was a record-breaking catch, and catfish over 2 meters are rare but not impossible. Rather than being the direct result of radiation, scientists believe that the large size of the Chernobyl catfish is down to the same factors that have allowed other animals in the region to thrive. The catfish are simply top of the food chain in the cooling pond. There are no predators and plenty of prey. Number 5. Chernobyl was the biggest nuclear disaster in human history. It could not be contained within the borders of the Soviet Union. After workers at a nuclear reactor in Sweden noticed high levels of radiation, the rest of the world learned of the terrifying event that had occurred days earlier. Chernobyl's impact was felt around the world. One of the more unusual places where it had a long-lasting impact was in farms in remote parts of the UK. Clouds of radionuclides billowed away from the Ukrainian city. At first, the winds blew these eastwards, but soon the direction changed, and the radioactive material was blown across Europe. On May 2nd, the clouds reached the United Kingdom, at just the same time as ordinary rainy weather. The rainwater, combined with radionuclides, fell to the earth, mostly in the highlands of North Wales, Cumbria, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. The damage this did depended on the type of soil that the water hit. Clay soils could absorb the radionuclides, or they would lie dormant for hundreds of years. But peaty soils didn't have this property. The radionuclides could be taken up by the plants that grew in it, and then the animals that ate those plants. This soon became a real problem for sheep farmers, particularly in Wales, which is well known for its lamb. At first, farmers joked about having sheep that glowed in the dark. The reality was that the danger was largely invisible. Some farmers reported sheep giving birth to lambs with health defects, although it's unclear whether this was a widespread phenomenon or something else. What was certain was that the sheep were giving off radiation. The authorities banned the sale of sheep in affected areas for a few weeks. A testing system was set up to ensure that no contaminated meat was entering the food chain. Restrictions stretched on into months and then years. The problem was that this could not be addressed with one devastating but quick action. When a herd of livestock shows signs of disease that cannot be cured, often farmers will have the whole herd culled to stop the disease from spreading. But in this case, it was the ground itself that was contaminated. Replacing one flock of sheep with another wouldn't make any difference. Luckily, the life of radiocaesium inside a living animal isn't a long one. Once sheep were moved from higher grounds to lower grazing areas, the radionuclides would usually disperse quickly. But this still caused problems for farmers. When a farmer wanted to sell or move sheep, a government tester would have to come to the farm. The sheep was brought in from the highlands, where it had been grazing, and tested. If the radioactivity levels were too high, they were marked and moved to a lower level area. This was normally where farmers sent their sheep to fatten them up just before they were sold for meat. If sheep spent too much time here, it would lower the quality of the meat and reduce the amount they could be sold for. If a sheep passed the inspection, it could be sold like any other, but in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, many people were skeptical of just how safe meat would be. Number 4. One of the most heroic stories from the Chernobyl disaster is that of the Chernobyl divers. 3 men ventured into the dark, flooded corridor just a week after the disaster. According to some, their actions may have saved the lives of millions of people, but what they actually achieved is debated. In the immediate response to the meltdown, gallons upon gallons of water were flooded into Reactor 4 at Chernobyl to try to stop the reaction and cool things down. That water flowed into the basement, taking with it radioactive debris. Eventually, this stopped, but the water remained pooling in the basement. Even before the divers, a few people had gone down there to measure the depth and the radioactivity. It was obviously a hazard to human health, and would be a significant problem for those trying to clear up the wreck of the power plant. It became an even bigger problem when the core began to heat up again in the days after the disaster. It needed constant cooling, but with the flooded basement, it wasn't possible to pump more water through the reactors. The basement had to be drained. There was also another fear held by some of the scientists and officials. They worried the molten core above the basement would melt through the concrete and reach the pool of water. It was so hot, they believed, that it would cause a steam eruption, which would destroy the rest of the power plant and send plumes of radioactive material across Europe. It would be a disaster that dwarfed what had already happened. Whether this would actually happen is debated. There's evidence that some parts of the molten core already reached the basement. Rather than causing an eruption, the corium solidified into a pumice-like rock that floated on the surface. It takes more than just a hot substance reaching a body of water to cause the kind of steam effects that officials were worried about. When a substance turns from a liquid into a gas, it expands in volume. If it has nowhere to go, then a blast will occur. But at Chernobyl, there was plenty of space for the steam to go, so it seemed unlikely one of these devastating blasts would happen. Even so, it was enough of a worry to spur liquidators into action, as was the real fear of the core becoming too hot again. Fire trucks were used to pump most of the water out of the basement, but there was still a layer that needed to be removed. This was when the Chernobyl divers came in. The three men were Alexei Onanenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov. The three men wore specifically made wetsuits and each carried 2 dosimeters. They went into the basement armed with a flashlight and a spanner to open valves that would release the water. The water was up to their knees, but the men found a pipe that they could walk along. Not only did it lead them to the valves, but it kept most of their bodies out of the water. Thankfully, the men were able to get to the valves and found they weren't difficult to open. They quickly did the job and emerged back to the surface. If there had been a crisis, it was averted. Water could now be used to cool the core again, and the cleanup of Chernobyl could resume. All three men continued to work as liquidators at the plant. In the aftermath of the mission, many assumed they would not live, but they actually didn't receive that high of a dose of radiation during the dive. All three men lived long past the disaster. Baranov passed away in 2005, but Onanenko and Bespalov are still alive today. Number 3. In 2019, the HBO series on the Chernobyl disaster received plenty of criticism from broadcasters in Russia. It was announced that a channel with close ties to the Kremlin will produce its own series on the disaster, one that would allegedly tell the story from Russia's point of view. The series was released in 2022 without much attention, but the earlier reports did draw attention to a conspiracy theory. The MTV show revolved around the theory that the CIA had planted a device within the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. This was what caused the destruction in April of 1986, rather than human error or design flaws. This wasn't the first time the conspiracy theory had been put forward. It actually dates back to the earliest days of the disaster. When the outside world first learned of the Chernobyl disaster, it wasn't directly from the USSR itself. The only information they could get came from what could be seen from the outside and from rumors that were coming out of Ukraine. This led to a lot of misinformation in the media, where reports indicated that things were much worse than they actually were. The Soviet government accused the US and other countries of trying to stoke fears, and this would soon evolve into the theory that they were actually to blame for the disaster. The CIA had infiltrated Soviet computer systems in the past, and it wasn't difficult to believe that had been done here. Even some people who worked at the plant subscribed to the theory. In interviews with workers after the disaster, some claimed there was no way this had been an accident and it had to be sabotage. There were a few different ways that people imagined this could take place. Some thought it might have been an actual device that had somehow been smuggled into the reactor. Others thought it had something to do with the design materials themselves, and that the faulty construction was actually the result of CIA interference. There was little in the way of evidence for this, and it seemed to mostly come from people not understanding what had actually happened. One small clue the conspiracy theorists pointed to was a small drawing that had appeared in a Soviet newspaper a week before the accident. The drawing had no connection to the text and seemed to be a map of the nuclear power plant, with a star symbolizing its destruction. This was allegedly a warning to the Soviet leaders, telling them what would happen if they didn't back out of the Afghan war. Number 2. Just months before the Chernobyl disaster, an article appeared in the local media discussing the potential for things to go seriously wrong at the power plant. While it may look like an eerie prophecy today, the writer was basing his judgment on the many other near misses that had occurred at Chernobyl since it began operation. Some of those near misses wouldn't come to light until long after 1986. The most dangerous accident before the terrible night in April of 1986 occurred 4 years earlier in September of 1982. The story is very similar to what would occur years later. A test was taking place in Reactor 1 ahead of a planned shutdown. In the few years since the Chernobyl plant had begun operations, there had been many shutdowns and power failures. This was blamed on bad construction, both of the plant itself and the parts that were brought in. Reactor 1 had undergone a lengthy maintenance period over the summer, so on the evening of September 9th, a test run was scheduled. The reactor levels were raised to just 20% of its peak level, when suddenly one of the channels within the reactor burst. The channel had quickly risen in temperature and deformed before bursting, exposing nuclear fuel and causing damage to the channels around it. Some of the fuel had traveled up to a steam area and mixed with the steam there before it vented off out of the power plant. At first, nobody in the control room did anything. They could tell that something was wrong, but they didn't know what. They continued as normal, expecting the situation to become clearer with time. They eventually realized this wasn't going to work, and the reactor needed to be shut down. AZ5, the same button that would be pressed in Reactor 4 4 years later, was pressed. This time there were no malfunctions. The control rods slid into place and the reactor was shut down. Unfortunately, events beyond this are shrouded in mystery and cover-ups. Exactly what caused the fuel channel to rupture is unknown. In the official KGB version of events, staff in the control room were to blame. They were manually opening and closing a valve to regulate the amount of water that was accessing this part of the reactor. But they made a mistake and closed the valve rather than opening it. This allowed the channel to heat up and cause the near meltdown. But those within the control room deny this. There was no criminal investigation, as would happen at other power plants when workers made mistakes. This has led many to believe that the KGB didn't want to look too closely into the disaster. Another theory is that there was simply a manufacturing problem. There were flaws in the design of the fuel channels, which caused this one to rupture. No proper investigation into the consequences of the 1982 accident took place, and it's likely the answers to this mystery will never be known. Number 1. Hidden in the aerial photos and footage taken directly after the Chernobyl disaster is a small red truck. At first, it doesn't look like anything out of the ordinary, but this was a truck 4 men risked their lives to save. 2 of them wouldn't survive the disaster, and where the truck is today is a mystery. The red truck was actually a Mercedes-Benz, equipped with high-tech equipment for measuring the vibrations of the turbines inside the nuclear plant. These turbines were supplied by the Turbo Atom plant, located in Kharkiv, Ukraine. After producing a successful model, the designers were encouraged to create a second design with cost in mind. The redesign used less metal, which kept costs down, but had some unintended consequences. Even small changes in operation could lead to the turbines vibrating and becoming unbalanced. To fix this, engineers would have to rebalance the turbines. It was a time-consuming effort and not a permanent fix. A longer-term solution required a group of specialists and specialist equipment. A mobile laboratory was purchased from a company in Switzerland. This had lots of high-tech equipment fitted inside a typical Mercedes-Benz truck. For months, this mobile laboratory and its engineers did their job, helping to resolve problems in various locations. In April of 1986, the factory received a letter from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The turbines in Reactor 4 were vibrating. The shutdown planned for later that month would be the perfect opportunity for the Kharkiv workers to come and resolve the issue. 4 Kharkiv workers were sent to Chernobyl, with the Mercedes-Benz mobile laboratory just in time for the Reactor 4 shutdown and disaster. The engineers needed to run experiments, measuring the vibrations when the turbines were at various levels of activity. They were supposed to park the truck outside the turbine hall and thread cables into the hall to get the data they needed. This would require making a cable channel in the wall, and the engineers decided on a simpler solution. The truck was driven directly into the turbine hall of Reactor 4, carefully navigating transportation corridors. The truck and the workers were here in the early hours of April 26th when the disaster struck. The roof of the turbine hall collapsed, and dust and nuclear fuel fell inside. The Kharkiv workers went inside to see what was going on and quickly realized just how terrible the disaster was. They wanted to help, but according to various plant workers, they were told to leave. Instead, they went back to the truck to try to salvage the equipment. It was very important to them, and even though they knew it was risking their lives, they wanted to get it out of harm's way. They tried to drive the truck back to their transport corridor, but the damage done to the building was too great. It had to be abandoned as the workers fell ill and were evacuated to the hospital. 2 of the workers would survive, though they were left with lifelong disabilities. Lead engineer Vladimir Savinkov and engineer Georgy Popov would succumb to the radiation sickness. After the disaster, there were loads of questions about what would be done with the truck. It had been removed from the turbine hall as workers tried to contain the disaster, and it was parked on the grounds outside. It's here where it could be seen in the famous photos from the disaster. The Kharkiv plant wanted to decontaminate the vehicle so it could continue its work. The survivors were told it would be named the Savinkov and Popov. But it soon became clear that decontamination couldn't happen. Where the truck is today remains a mystery. In the months after the disaster, it vanished. By the time it disappeared, most of the vehicle graveyards had already filled up. The truck has never been seen in one of these. One story states that the truck was removed by the KGB, who told workers they needed to analyze the data that had been collected. But it's possible this was just one of many rumors that sprang up after the disaster, and the truck is simply hidden somewhere remote in the exclusion zone. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.